We are in the Christmas season, a season when we have our traditions, our beliefs, our childish, in a good way, celebrations. This year, I wanted to take some time, a couple of Sundays, and look at some of the other symbols of Christmas that maybe we're not so aware of, but yet have fed into the traditions, the cultures, the celebrations that we all partake in at Christmas time. This Sunday, we're going to look at the origin of Santa Claus. Did you know that Santa Claus, jolly old St. Nick, the fat guy in the red suit with the reindeer, giving gifts and going ho, ho, ho all the time, was actually a real person? His name was St. Nickolas. He didn't go ho, ho, ho. At least as far as we know. He went by many names in his lifetime: Nicholas of Myra, Nicholas of Bari, Nicholas the Wonder Worker. And through the centuries, he became known as the patron saint of sailors. Do we have any sailors? Any former Navy or anything? No? Merchants, archers, repentant thieves, children, brewers, pawnbrokers, unmarried people, students. The list kind of goes on and on. You notice he was pretty popular. However, not a whole lot is known about him. The writings of his day have been lost. He was born somewhere around March 12th in the year 270. And we do know that he passed away on December 6th in 343. He lived in the Greek, or was born in the Greek seaport of Patara in Lycia, and his parents were wealthy early followers of the religion that would eventually come to be called Christianity. And St. Nicholas would actually have a part to play in that. For he was elected, or I guess appointed or commanded, to serve at the First Council of Nicaea in 325. We don't know how he participated or what he did on the council, but we know he was there. Eventually, he was made Bishop of Myra, and he was cast into prison twice. Once for displeasing the Emperor Diocletian, and he was released after Constantine rose to power. And again, in another incident I will share with you in a minute. Well, actually, I'll share with you right now. He was defrocked and imprisoned for slapping a priest named Arius, also at the Council of Nicaea. A priest who championed the idea of Christ being a child of God rather than God incarnate. Now, that was a big deal in those days. This idea of Jesus being God incarnate came from the Hellenistic side of Christianity, the influence of the Greeks, quite simply because so many of their gods and goddesses and demigods and stuff were part human, part God, so it fit. But there was a lot of controversy over whether Jesus was God incarnate or a child of God. And that controversy raged from the 4th century until the 18th century. It was not finally established by the Catholic Church formally until the 18th century. However, he was released and reinstated. There are many, many legends about him. Stories that he resurrected 3 children that had been murdered, calmed a storm at sea, saving the sailors of the ship he was on, saving 3 soldiers from wrongful execution, and my favorite, chopping down a tree possessed by a demon. I'd kind of like to see that tree myself. In his lifetime, he made pilgrimages to Egypt and Syria and Israel. But the most important story, the one that has resonated down through the centuries, that gave rise to the creation of a figure called Santa Claus, was the story of him dropping bags of gold down the chimneys of a family in his town. This family did not have money to pay their daughter's dowry. And in those days, if you couldn't do that, your daughters would probably be sold into prostitution. He had inherited his parents' wealth, but he decided to give it all away, and he decided that this family truly needed some of it. So the story is that he threw bags of gold either down the chimney or through the open window one at a time so that each daughter could have a dowry. And by the time it happened the third time, the father realized that somebody was throwing these in, and stayed up all night to try to catch him. And according to the stories, he did. And Nicholas said, "Please don't tell anybody." Well, obviously he told somebody because we know the story. There's an interesting little historical note to Nicholas. He is the only one of the saints whose bones we actually have in one place. You know how in the ancient times it was customary for them to distribute the bones to different churches around Europe? Yeah, his are all in one place, and they've actually, through DNA, determined that most likely it is his skeleton. A little bit of trivia there. So we know that he truly did exist. He was a real person who lived at a turbulent time in the Roman Empire. And so many of the stories and histories were lost. But there are references. There are references as to how influential his idea was in the early church, that the soul could function without a body. A body could not function without a soul. That was his theory on how resurrection worked. But how did he become Santa Claus? Well, we have this story of him giving gifts secretly at night when no one was looking. Surely that played into it. But there were many other things that led to that. And there are similar stories told about other early church leaders, especially in those days. You know, a lot of people don't realize, but in those days, women were powerful figures in the church. They were priestesses in what would become the Christian church, clear up until almost the 9th century, 4th for sure. So the historicity is not disputed. But history gets changed. And out of fact arise legends. And so celebrations began to be practiced around his life, his birth, and his death. December 6th became the feast day of St. Nicholas, still is in the Catholic Church and the Greek Orthodox churches. And in those days, in the early days, Christmas was not a holiday. There was a Mass, but that was it. It was feasts of St. Stephen, feasts of St. Nicholas, that were the big, important holidays. And because of his travels to the Holy Land, legends began to arise that he would go to Egypt in one night and back, or Israel in one night and back. Probably he didn't do that. But you can see where it began to feed into this legend of Santa Claus traveling the world and giving gifts in one night. By the 13th century, most of Europe celebrated his feast day. Sometime around the 14th century, a new tradition began to evolve as Christianity spread into the Nordic countries. He came to be called Sinterklaas, and children would put out their shoes in the hopes of having them filled with fruit and maybe a coin or some candy. Nuns would give out baskets of food to hungry families in the dark of the night on his feast day. And so the modern Santa Claus began to take shape. The Santa Claus we know today came from the celebrations in the Nordic country of Sinterklaas. He was always depicted in a red bishop's robe and crown with a big white beard, and riding a white horse. No reindeer yet. They came later. By the dawn of the 20th century, he looked a lot like we know him today, except for one part. He was skinny as a rail. Thanks in part to the cartoonist Thomas Nast, who did some work for Coca-Cola, he began to put on weight. And it was in 1906 when an advertising Coca-Cola campaign Coca-Cola had, where he was really big, that we know he finally took the form we know him as today. I found out there is a movement to put him on a diet, by the way. So that's a brief history of this character we call Santa Claus that's so much a part of this celebration of Christmas. But what does he represent? Why is it so important? Other than just something fun for the kids, could it be that there is something we can learn from these legends, these stories, these fun things we create around this holiday? Let's look at some of the qualities that Santa Claus represents. He's known for his generous spirit. symbolized by the acts of giving gifts unconditionally. Originally, it was unconditionally. You didn't have to be good. And in most of the stories, he's pretty lenient. He's known as being kind, often depicted as a kind and compassionate figure, promoting goodwill and positive behavior. Definitely joyful, shown as a joyful, merry character, embodying festive and celebratory nature of the season. He's caring. He cares for the well-being of all the children and is associated with the idea of making wishes come true, fostering a sense of care and concern for others. And of course, there's the magic and wonder, the sense of enchantment that we feel as children when we see the lights and the candles and the songs and the celebration, and we gather together from near and far as family. And there's some redemptive qualities, some mercy. Giving gifts to children originally, he didn't give coal originally. That came quite a bit later after the Industrial Revolution. I could do a whole sermon on that one. So Santa represents all of these things in our culture. But what about in our spirituality? What about in our unity philosophy? We know in unity that we see symbols as powerful tools connecting us with spiritual truths. That these symbols represent inner qualities and inner strengths and powers in each and every one of us. So St. Nicholas or Santa Claus could be interpreted this way as well, representing the qualities of love, joy, and generosity that connect us all. And in the power of imagination and manifestation. We place a strong emphasis on this power, on the power of the mind to create images of what we want to have in our lives and in the world, because everything starts in the power of imagination. If you look at Genesis closely, Genesis 1 and Genesis 2, Genesis 1 is a story of God creating the universe in consciousness. Genesis 2 is the manifestation in the physical realm. Likewise with Santa Claus. We imagine being like that, being benevolent, being joyful, expressing love, aligning with that energy of generosity and abundance. Think about what we believe about giving and receiving. We know that that which we give forth, we not only receive back, but we expand it into the world. When we focus on that which is good and true and perfect, to quote somebody, Paul, when we focus on those things, we give them energy, they expand. When we focus on the ideas of what St. Nicholas, Santa Claus represent, we're making those qualities real in our experience. Our generosity, our love, our joy. And we might find ourselves going, ho, ho, ho. Abundance flows through an open heart. And St. Nicholas, St. Nicholas represented an open heart. Giving is an expression of divine abundance. And that act of giving brings to us and expands from us joy and fulfillment. What about the childlike faith and wonder that is part of this whole experience? Those are very important qualities. Jesus himself said, become as little children. He didn't mean be childish. He meant be filled with that faith, that wonder, that exuberance, that life, innocence. That innocence and openness allows us and reminds us to approach life with curiosity, trust, and a sense of awe. That's something I think we miss sometimes, is that sense of awe in life. Those of you who have or have had little children or grandchildren, you know when you're out there in nature and they see a simple flower, how it fills them with awe and sheer wonder. And when we're in that energy, we become creative because our imaginations can do anything with that. St. Nicholas and Santa Claus also represent timelessness and the eternal presence of spirit. We have that nature within us, that divine nature that life is endless and possibilities are endless. The metaphysics of Santa Claus then can be explained in these qualities and these timeless energies of love and joy and giving that transcend our usual boundaries that we place around things. But what about cultural inclusivity? Every culture has some sort of winter holiday, and every one of those winter holidays involves some aspect of this, some aspect of giving from your heart, of being filled with wonder, of seeing light everywhere. So it could be that St. Nicholas is also representative of embracing inclusivity, recognizing that everyone has different ways of seeing holidays, different ways of understanding spirit, and yet they're all the same. In the end, they are all the same. And finally, community and connection. We place a lot of importance on the idea of spiritual community and interconnectedness. That's one thing we all do so well, is this is a family, and it always has room for more, so welcome. There is always room at our table, and always has been in this community. That's what makes, I'm going to brag on us, that's what makes this community so wonderful. Am I right? Yes. So St. Nicholas, Santa Claus symbolize the spirit of community and connection, reminding us of the shared humanity we have with one another. And finally, within a unity framework, we would focus on the symbolic, the transformative, and the spiritual aspects associated with this figure. We would emphasize the positive and universal qualities that Santa brings and represents, encouraging individuals to align with that energy, with those ideas within themselves. Love, joy, generosity. So in the end, St. Nicholas, Santa Claus, and indeed all of the symbols we have for Christmas are about belief. What do we choose to believe? Do we choose to believe the messages we are bombarded with every single day about how bad things are? Or do we choose to believe that hope is always present, that abundance is always present, that love and joy and peace are always present, and that it is our purpose, our place to become like St. Nicholas, to become like Santa Claus, to give forth these gifts to one another, and even to those we do not know. In 1947, Charles Fillmore wrote a Christmas greeting that was published in Unity magazine. And you have to think about, first of all, what was happening in the world in 1947. As Christmas approached, World War II had just ended, and much of the world was still in recovery, or even just beginning to recover from that experience. The Soviets had just achieved their first nuclear reaction and were on the verge of building their first atomic bomb. And many people in churches, in politics, in other places were saying that civilization was ending, the world was ending. It was all going to stop. You know, things are not that much different today if you look around. We have politicians telling us that, oh, it's all over, this is the end. We have churches that are telling people it's finally going to happen after 2,000 years. Things were not much different. But Charles Fillmore always was able to see the future. Not the details of the future, but the future that still embodied hope, that still embodied love, that still embodied possibility, that still embodied generosity. And so he wrote this Christmas greeting. There are so many things I would like to discuss with you. What does the Lord say about the signs of the times? Will there be another war? How about the prophets who say that our civilization is about to end? Well, frankly, I have had no direct revelation of any of these things. I only know that our God, who controls the world through his people, is greater and far more powerful than all of the destructive forces of the universe. And that if only a few of us stand steadfastly for truth and righteousness, we will prevail. And our civilization will go right forward, right formed to its fulfillment in the new millennium. United in this truth, we shall have a Merry Christmas and a Happy New Year. And so, since every aspect of the Christmas experience revolves around that belief that God is in charge, that we are evolving to the next level of consciousness, that the Christ can be born in each and every one of us, that goodness still exists, that love still exists, that solutions are still possible, and that the spirit of Christmas is the awakening of the realization, the mass of the indwelling Christ consciousness in you and me. In that energy, in that knowing, I close with the same thing Charles said. United in this truth, we shall stand together and have a Merry Christmas and a Happy New Year.